How you doing?
Okay, how are you?
Okay. Yeah, me and Doug were there, and Riston, Mike and Kate's son.
Lord took him into
I was there yesterday.
church.
Were you?
You took a break here.
When were we there? It was before. Well,
That was amazing.
yeah, we were probably still there around 10. We might have gotten done right before 10
You know how
I had to work yesterday
in the
because I
morning.
requested next Saturday off.
You were there at 2 p.m., you
I
said?
went over there
Yeah.
yesterday.
Yeah, we were there several hours before you, but yeah, I guess there was a man in from Cleveland, I think, and his father lived up there. Can't remember what room it was. It was on the 4th floor.
I
And
just wanted
We usually
No,
don't
they
go
just don't have-
up on the, upper floors.
yeah, just because that's the living spaces.
Usually, I mean, unless they like, push their pendant or pull their
Yeah.
thing or whatever, to, go
Yeah.
turn it off to see,
Yeah,
if they're okay.
Right.
Birthday coming up.
But other than that, we usually don't go up
there.
yeah, I can see why. That's their place that's their apartments, right?
Well, plus the ones on like the 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors are the independent living people.
Yeah,
So
You and I.
since they're independent.
doesn't feel independent if you got staff walking around the hallways,
so,
right?
like, so since they're independent,
Yeah.
we can't really do a lot for them.
Yeah.
To go up there and turn their things off.
Yeah,
Or whatever.
yeah, we were, but they, we were picking up donations for the ecumenical storehouse. So.
Ooh, you just won the prize of the day, most loved
This is
person.
our last Sunday
I have to
here,
look
right?
around.
Yep, sure is.
It's a low bar.
Your Sunday
It is.
late, you're sucking down.
I'll tell everybody that too when we start
Well,
talking.
that's okay. It's easy. Makes you stuff.
Well, you'll appreciate
Makes you
your,
appreciate the other.
your high price coffee.
We may want to get the high price coffee. Make sure somebody remembers it because we.
He
won't-
got
did,
it.
he just brought it in.
Okay, no,
I
I
said
mean,
he
no. Remember where? Because if it gets left up here, we won't be here after today.
And
It has to
No,
move
I'll
downstairs.
protect it. We'll get it relocated.
Yeah,
Air
it's got to be
the lizard.
relocated.
why are there X's on the floor?
That's where they're moving stuff.
Stand here.
That's where they're repairing the carpet.
Where they what?
Oh man, that's pretty close. It's almost 10. Yeah. So just as a reminder, this is our last Sunday in this classroom. Maybe not forever, but for at least for a while. We'll be meeting down in room 108, which is the room in the corner there that was Mary
Man, the
Jane's.
floor looks good in there.
Yeah, we must be special because we're going to have like the newest room in the church whenever we get down there next Sunday. But
Yeah, it's looking good. I saw it yesterday.
yeah, it is looking good. So anyway, don't forget, and I'll put something on the Facebook page too, just for those of you guys who see that, to remind us to be down there. But the table and all that stuff, we're going to move and get it down to our new classroom and the coffee maker. That's why I said don't forget Rick's coffee, since I saw him put it in that cabinet. And I'm going to set up a switch over there for First Christian to hook up their audio video equipment. They're going to set up right over there where that table is. So I'll remind you too, Joy, we won't be here next week. We'll be in the 108 down on the 1st floor. So that's what we were just talking about. All right, so announcements. Family Life Committee meeting on... it's in the narthex. It's today, but it's in... I was trying to figure out where this was. It's actually in the narthex after the worship service today. And they're going to discuss the upcoming Ice Cream Sunday event. So then the summer school supply drive is still going on. So looking for backpacks of all sizes, binders, college ruled paper, ink pens, pencil boxes, that sort of thing. And then they're also taking up donations for personal hygiene items, including socks and underwear and deodorant and that sort of thing for boys and girls. And then so the youth will be taking this up to the Appalachian Ministries of the Smokies on the 20th. They'll take all these supplies up for those are the folks who are going to distribute those supplies. There's a school bash, youth cookout with games to celebrate the new school year on Wednesday, July 27th at 6 p.m. So all the students from grades 6 to 12 are welcome to come to that. we're coming pretty close. We're getting close to August 1st, which is when the nightlife signups are going to start. The small group that's, we've talked about, that'll be, I assume they have all the houses and hosts figured out, or at least some figured out at this point, for those folks who are going to get together and go through Gen Hat Makers, simple and free. Ice Cream Sunday is going to be on July 24th. That's going to be in the fellowship hall at 5 p.m. So obviously there's going to be ice cream and fellowship and games and things like that. So they actually ask, if you have a favorite game, you think somebody else would like to play, bring it. Also bring, ice cream toppings and just any kind of sweets you want to bring. Let's see. There. Okay, and then the trustees are still working on, removing excess furniture and all the old exercise equipment. We had more exercise equipment than I realized in this church. If you go down the fellowship hall, there's a bunch on the back wall to your left when you walk in. There's like an elliptical and a bike and one of those ab things, you lay on the ground. Anyway, I was down there just kind of chuckling at all the stuff we had here. But there were lots of tables and chairs that were picked up by somebody. I can't remember who it was. I think it was one of the churches, but they took a whole lot of stuff off of our hands. So we're grateful for that, because ideally we can just get rid of all this stuff. I know some of it will eventually go to the dump or be distributed to somewhere, maybe Habitat or somebody who takes some of the things. But there are some of the stuff, some of the tables and the platforms that were manufactured years ago. I think we're going to hang on to some of that, and so those curtains that Teddy has hung up down there, that's kind of where keep those things out of sight until they need to be used. But they're cleaning out all those closets and everything back there so that the band can move stuff in there and that sort of thing, since it's all kind of domino effect of losing this third floor, which I think will end up being a good thing. Get us to purge. It's kind of like moving, you get rid of all your old stuff that you've kept that you don't really need. So, all right, well, that's it for the announcements.
My wife's definition of what you don't really need doesn't concern.
Well, that's often a very subjective thing.
Right.
It's not objective, as we have gone over the differences between. Yeah, so I know it's hard. I mean, I have stuff that I don't need, but I keep it as, because it's a nostalgic or something, and then I don't know if that's even a good idea or a good reason. Is it really all that important if it's in a plastic bin in your attic where you never see it? But then it bothers you to think of getting rid of it, right? So it's a conundrum. All right, well, let's pray and we'll start Sunday school. Lord, we just thank you so much for another opportunity to gather together in your name, to learn about you, to discuss these things that come from your word and from thinking of you. And we just pray that you'd bless our time together, be with our worship services, and send us home safely. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. There's another guy preaching today named Rick, also from CBF, but it's not the same Rick that preached last week, so it's kind of confusing. But so looking forward. I don't think I had heard that was Rick Bennett last week, right?
Yeah,
so I had heard him preach before.
Yeah.
I remember. I'm not sure if I've ever met this this fellow that's preaching today, but I'm looking forward to it. So last week we finished up our discussion of the moral argument, for God's existence, and today we're going to begin looking at this new argument called the ontological argument. I briefly mentioned this last week before we left, but the ontological argument was formulated by a Benedictine monk named Anselm in the 11th century. And so Anselm's argument is based on God as the greatest conceivable being, something than which nothing greater can be conceived. And so Anselm essentially argues that once you understand God as the greatest conceivable being, then you will consequently understand that God simply must exist, else he would not be the greatest conceivable being. So, a greatest conceivable being at a minimum, is going to have the property of existence, right? It's going that's what would make it the greatest conceivable being, at least foundationally. And so it must exist. That's basically what Anselm's argument would be. Otherwise, it would not be the greatest. So Anselm argues that once you really understand what God is, once you really understand these properties of, something than which nothing greater can be conceived, then you will see that God simply must exist. And this is how Anselm kind of understands what's going on in Psalm 14:1, where it says the fools say in their hearts that there is no God. So Anselm actually asks this in one of his written text. So then, why did the fool say in his heart there is no God, when it is so evident to the rational mind that you among all beings exist most greatly? Why indeed, except because he is stupid and a fool? So maybe leave that part out if you're trying to give that last part out if you're trying to, But anyway, that's just kind of where Anselm was coming from. So he's essentially communicating with God there and kind of thinking through these things. But again, I might not bring up that last line in a discussion with an unbeliever or anything, but that's just where he's at. And so, a host of prominent thinkers since Anselm have argued, or they've defended Anselm's argument in their own, and stated it in their own way. But they all share this common thread of trying to deduce the existence of God from the very concept of God. It's very interesting. I really like this argument, whether or not it's not supposed to be a knockdown argument for God's existence, and whatever your takeaway might be, that's just what it is. But I think it's a really neat argument. But probably the most sophisticated version of this argument, it was actually put forth by a modern 20th century philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, and I've mentioned him in here before. But in order to work through Plantinga's version of the argument, we have to familiarize ourselves with the semantics of possible worlds. And so when we talk about possible worlds, we're not talking about planets. We're not talking about even other universes. We're not even talking about concrete objects. So we're not talking about the multiverse or the many worlds hypothesis or that sort of thing, where there's potentially an infinite amount of other universes, from which ours is just one. But rather, talking about possible worlds is just a way of talking about the way things could have been, or the way things might be. It's a state of affairs of some kind. So the following would be examples of a state of affairs, like Joe Biden was elected president of the United States in 2022, or Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, or Gary Giles, for whatever years has been a member of First Baptist Church and attends Sunday school at First Baptist Church. That's an example of a state of affairs, and these are actual states of affairs. Obviously, these are the way things are in the actual world. But it seems like these states of affairs could have been different, right? It seems like some different state of affairs could have obtained where Joe Biden wasn't elected, POTUS in 2020, or where Russia didn't invade Ukraine in February of 2022. So this is what we're talking about when using possible worlds. Possible worlds, at its most basic, is just this terminology that has to do with the nature of possibility and what could have been the case. It's a way reality might be. A possible world also, in order for them to be valid, it has to be something that really could exist. So whatever conjunctions, however many you want to take and put together to construct a possible world, those conjunctions have to be possible, that both individually and together to make up this possible world. It can't just be logically possible; it also has to be feasible. If you remember, we've talked about, for example, it might be logically possible for God to create a world where humans exist and there is no sin, there is no fall. But that might not actually be feasible for God to actualize for whatever reason, free will, that sort of thing. So as such, discussions of possible worlds allow us to conceptualize real possibilities. And we do this all the time when we talk about, things. For example, we talk about things that we're going to do. We do this because we believe that these things are real possibilities and that we have the freedom to actualize or not actualize these things. So possible worlds, semantics, again, is just a way of conceptualizing this sort of thing, a way of illustrating possibilities, the way that a diagram might illustrate a mathematical equation, something like that. So there's the actual world, and then there are possible worlds, of which the actual world is one, which allow us to conceive various descriptions of the way the world could have been. So what the ontological argument wants to do is to show that if God's existence is possible, if there is a possible world where a maximally great being exists, then he exists in all of them, which would include the actual world, which would entail God's existence. Now, the ontological argument does assume that the concept of God is a coherent concept, that it is possible that God exists. So it's assuming that the concept of God or a greatest conceivable being is possible. If that concept of a greatest conceivable being is incoherent or impossible, then it would be a metaphysical impossibility, which just means it would be impossible for it to exist. And so God would not exist in any possible world. The word God in that case would just be nothing more than saying square circle or something like that. Those words don't actually refer to anything. They're not something. They're just two words put together that don't refer to anything. So this argument does assume that it is possible for God to exist. Now, back to Plantinga's version of the argument. Plantinga conceives of God as a being that is maximally excellent. And so maximal excellence is just his way of describing things that we've already talked about. It would be a being who is all-knowing, who is all-powerful, who is morally perfect or all good, however you want to state that. And so a being which has these properties, is more excellent than a being that's limited in knowledge or that's, limited in moral perfection, limited in power, that sort of thing. So a maximally excellent being will be one that has these things to the fullest degree: omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection, that sort of thing. And so a being that has all these maximally excellent properties is what Plantinga calls a maximally great being. So God, in our understanding, would be a maximally great being. He has these properties of knowledge and power and goodness to their, ultimate degree. So if the existence of a maximally great being is possible, then there is a possible world where a maximally great being exists. Remember, a possible world is just this way of thinking about a possibility of the way that the world is. But if a maximally great being is one that exists, in every possible world, and then there is a possible world where a maximally great being exists, or maybe I've said that backwards. If a maximally great being exists in one possible world, then he would exist in all possible worlds, which would include the actual world. So therefore, Anselm would argue, and Plantinga's version and others would argue that therefore God exists. So I'm going to read, in case that's kind of confusing, to try and help, I'll read this. If you have any trouble, please ask. I'm trying to lay this out as best as I can, but I do have a formulation here of Plantinga's version of the ontological argument, so I'll read it. And it's basically 5 premises, and then you got the conclusion, which is the 6th step. So premise 1 says, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. So in other words, maximal greatness, this idea of all, being all-knowing, all-powerful, all good, existing in all possible worlds, that this is possible. 2, if it is possible that such a being exists, then a maximally great being would exist in at least some possible world. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in all possible worlds. That's 3. 4, if a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, then it exists in the actual world. 5, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. And so therefore the conclusion is a maximally great being exists. So is there any questions up to this point? Can I clarify something? Because
Could you just say that again?
the one through the premises, yes. So 1 is, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. 2, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. And I don't really know if you need 6, but 6 says, therefore, a maximally great being exists. You know, you need it because you have to have a conclusion for an argument that's written out like that. And so, you know, therefore, a maximally great being exists. So, you know, whether or not it's surprising to you, the premises 2 through 5 are pretty much uncontroversial. No one really argues with the logic that follows there. So what, you know, premise 1 is really the linchpin of this argument, that it is possible that a maximally great being exists. That's the real point of contention, and has been the real point of contention in this argument ever since Anselm's time, really. So what we have to ask is there warrant for thinking that premise 1 is true, that a maximally great being, you know, that it is possible that this being exists? So, and the question at hand is it metaphysically possible that a maximally great being exists? It's not just like, well, I don't really want to get into. So there's difference in we're not just talking about what's called epistemic knowledge. Epistemic knowledge would just be like what we, you know, well, it's possible God exists, or it's possible God doesn't exist. We can't really know. That's kind of like epistemic knowledge. That's just knowledge that's epistemic possibility. I'm sorry, that an epistemic possibility is just something that we arrive at from our knowledge, from what we know. And so in that regard, we could say, well, it's possible God exists, but it's, you know, it's also possible that God doesn't exist. What we're talking about is in the realm of metaphysics in philosophy, which is the, you know, that's in philosophy, that's the kind of the study of existence, of being, and that sort of thing.
It bothers me. Well, to me, it's evident that there's a creator, and he's God. And he's
Sure.
a maximally powerful being because he created the universe. And the universe is a creation of unintelligent or unexplainable wisdom.
Yeah.
It's just, I cannot understand people that look at the creation and say there's no God.
Well, I can agree. I mean, I think that, you know, what you're saying could kind of, you know, this argument's independent, but I think what you're saying is, you know, you're talking about the evidence that would actually lend some support, you know, to this argument, that this sort of being, it is possible for this being to exist.
Yeah.
And this whole argument is the fact that if it is possible for this being to exist, then it just does. The logical conclusion is that it does.
How do you prove that?
What's that?
That's not the point. It's how do you prove this?
Yeah.
You know?
And again, the ontological argument, it is an argument, you know, for God's existence, but, you know, I don't know of anybody that thinks it's like the best argument. It's just one of many. And like I said, I really like the argument because I think it is, you know, I mean,
That's just because your mind is convoluted.
the argument as it's laid out by like Plantinga and others is logically sound.
Yeah.
Plantinga probably wrote it out in the best, I think, easy to understand steps to show the logical validity, the soundness of the argument. But you could still, again, the biggest area of contention is that, you know, is it possible that a maximal great being exists? This is where people are going to argue, well, no. And we'll look at a couple of those, whether or not it actually is possible. I didn't mean to. I don't even. I'm not even going to talk. What I was getting at was there's this difference between something being epistemically possible and metaphysically possible. Being metaphysically possible, something is either possible, is necessary, or something is either impossible or it's necessarily true. That's just the way it works. And so what we're talking about here is metaphysical possibility. And I don't even, maybe that doesn't help. So we'll just skip on past that unless we have some questions that end up probing into that area. But does the idea of a being, which is all knowing, all powerful, and all good in every possible world seem to be a coherent idea and therefore possibly exist? I would think yes. In order for the ontological argument to fail, the idea of a maximally great being would have to be incoherent. We would have to think this is not possible. It would need to be like the concept of like a married bachelor. Right off, that doesn't necessarily seem logically invalid, but whenever you start to understand the concept of what it means to be a bachelor, you realize that I'm saying a married, unmarried man, which is logically, that's incoherent. That just doesn't work. So once you understand the underlying meaning of what it means to be married, you can see that a married bachelor, or the underlying meaning of the word bachelor, you can see that a married bachelor is contradictory and couldn't possibly exist. But the idea of a maximally great being at least doesn't seem to suffer from this, sort of incoherence. It seems perfectly coherent. I mean, as we talk about it, I don't, it seems like a coherent thing. It seems that we can talk about this idea coherently without any sort of, it may be, there's a lot of questions involved, but.
Well, it's an argument that, it's like there are beings. One of them has to be maximum, but that doesn't mean that it's God.
Well, what would you call that? What would you call a being?
A superior being.
Yeah.
I'm not as strong as you, for instance, or.
Oh well, yeah. You're talking about maybe degrees of, but what we're talking about.
But maximum doesn't mean the maximum. It means greater than
this argument. It means the nothing greater can be conceived. Okay. So that's why I like Anselm's definition, because the way that Plantinga and others have used maximally greatest. I like greatest conceivable being the best. This is a being that has these properties, certain properties of which nothing greater can be conceived. So yes, this would be at the limit. We've reached the tippy top. Yes, exactly. So I see what you're saying, though. I see that does need to be clarified and understood. So if it is the case that this is coherent, that this concept is coherent, that there's this being that has these the properties of maximal greatness, then I think that does offer some support for the warrant of believing that premise one is true. When it comes to the objections, the most popular objections to the ontological argument is to construct a parody of it and then show how it leads to things that are absurd. And this goes all the way back to Anselm's life. That he actually had a contemporary. There was this other Benedictine monk, and his name was Galnilo. Not really sure how you pronounce it. But Galnilo's response to Anselm's argument was to conceive of the most perfect island. He basically said, a modern parody that I've heard too is, I can conceive of the greatest, pizza, the greatest conceivable pizza. Since the greatest conceivable island or pizza, must have the property of necessary existence in every possible world, then they're a greatest conceivable island or a greatest conceivable pizza must exist. In one of the debates that I saw with William Lane Craig, there was a guy that made the comment that, well, the smelliest, the greatest, there's a greatest conceivable being that's the smelliest being in existence, or that sort of thing. But the problem with all these parodies, whichever one of those that you choose, is that none of these have, like what we were just talking about, none of these have these maximal properties, these properties of which nothing greater can be conceived. but properties like omniscience and omnipotence and that sort of thing, they don't really suffer from this. The property of omniscience, like we were talking about, it has a ceiling. When you say all-knowing, that when knowing all truths, there is no greater. You can't go above that. You can't go beyond that. Same thing, I think, with being all-powerful or morally perfect. There's a ceiling where it just doesn't get any better than that. But that's not the case with things like islands or pizza or something's, odor. These things don't have these inherent maximal properties. There could always be more palm trees or banana trees on the island. There could always be better fishing or, better soil for farming or something like that. I mean, whatever it is that makes up, there could be more, native dancers or something, whatever makes up the better island. And the same thing with pizza. There could always be more of pepperonis or whatever it is you prefer, or they could always be sourced better from, better ingredients.
Subjective.
There you go. That's exactly that.
That's the problem.
Yes.
Well, one of the problems I have is greatest conceivable being.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a finite being.
Mm-hmm.
I can only conceive of so many things and to such a level.
Mm-hmm.
And I realize that being finite, there are things above my understanding, and I cannot even conceive them. That's the problem. The word conceive is a problem.
But I mean, I don't know what that is, though. If I can't conceive of something, I don't even know how to talk about that as being possibly real. So that wouldn't enter the. I don't think that would be. We're talking about conceivable, something conceivable from
something
our point
that we can understand
from our point of view.
Yeah,
Yes.
but I don't know that we can understand God.
Well, we're not trying to understand God so much. We're trying to think of that God and at least in having these sorts of properties that we can conceive of, that what we're calling God.
Yes.
There may be more to God. We're not trying to limit God. We're saying that could it be possible that there exists this being that has these maximally great properties? And if it is possible, the argument would try to show then that being just does exist. Again, we're trying to deduce the existence of God from the very concept of God, or that's what the argument's trying to do. Whether or not it succeeds is going to be up to each individual.
Yeah, I don't have a problem.
But I just like the argument.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with the argument. I just don't think it's necessary.
Yeah, maybe not. I wouldn't argue that the argument's necessary. It's just an argument, and it falls within the realm of natural theology. So we're discussing it, and there are people who have, who really like the argument, and of course, this is one of those arguments where I don't think you're going to change anybody's biases or anything. I think you might have. I know of, I have read and seen testimonies of people who have been led to change their attitude towards God or whatnot through actually through science and some other philosophical arguments, maybe like the moral argument or something. But this one I've never read anybody that said the ontological argument showed me that God exists. But it is an argument, and I think it's got I think it's fairly it's strong, but again, it's not supposed to be a knockdown argument. But Adrian,
it's the best that we can conceive of a knockdown.
it's a good one, I think. But Adrian pointed out, the problem with all these parodies that people have come up. Each of us would have a different opinion of what makes the greatest island or the greatest pizza or the smelliest person or whatnot. Whereas in contrast, the concepts of being all-knowing and all-powerful, they don't seem to really. Those properties don't seem to suffer from this issue. They have this ceiling, and then it just stops. You can't talk about something having more knowledge than something that has the knowledge of all truths. So that's just the limit there. So there's another problem with these parodies is that, what if we said there's a possible world where the universe exists just as a space-time singularity, which at one point in time in the past, we believe that actually. So what about a possible world where the universe just is in that state? It's a space-time singularity. How could you have a pizza or an island or something in that condition? You couldn't, right? Those are products of the physical world as we know it. But, even though those concepts couldn't exist in those in that possible world, well, for one, since they wouldn't be possible in that possible world, they can't be. That means they're not possible in all possible worlds, which means
Right.
they're not maximally great, which means they fail to be parodies of to really be objections to the argument. But in contrast to that, a maximally great being, and as we've described God already, could be immaterial and transcend space and time, transcend the physical limitations of space and time, and could be necessarily existent. And so it could exist. God, this greatest conceivable being, could still exist in the possible world where the universe is just a space-time singularity.
Are you using the word parody different than what as a
Parody, I guess, kind of like a caricature.
an argument against?
Yes,
It's
yes.
the way it's being used.
Yes, that's the way. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're just taking making like a caricature of the ontological argument to object that it's sound. But those parodies, on close reflection, really just turn out to be incoherent, and they don't exist in other possible worlds, so they can't be maximally great, or can even conceived that way. But that is the ontological argument. It's really an argument for the metaphysical possibility of God's existence, and then from there you move forward. But yes, Joy.
Well, so what about a maximally evil being?
I was thinking the same thing.
A maximally evil being.
The devil.
Let's see. I hadn't really thought about that, honestly.
You can be
I've not.
maximally evil but not know all.
Like,
So he would still be below
yeah,
the maximally.
that's actually a good point. I guess you could. Well, I mean, so you would have to say that's one of the three big properties. So let's say like Plantinga's maximally, so it all-knowing, all-powerful, but not morally perfect, but the opposite of that, moral. I guess being evil would be moral imperfection. So I don't know. I don't know if that would. I guess that would come back to, well, we wouldn't think of evil as a maximally great property.
We
Would
haven't
we?
defined this person as a maximally great, but a maximally evil, right? And doesn't the argument, isn't the turning part in the argument that we define God as maximally perfect or whatever, and if God didn't exist, that would make God less perfect. And it seems like for a maximally evil being, if that being didn't exist, they would be less evil.
Yeah, well, I think I don't know that we would really get into those degrees. I think what we would say here is that I think, given we're talking about metaphysical possibility, that either we're just basically saying that either this being the concept of such a being, a maximally great being, is possible, otherwise it's impossible. It's either impossible, it's not possible for it to be true, or it is possible for it to be true. But yeah, I mean, obviously a being that wasn't morally perfect in this regard would just not be a maximally great being. It wouldn't meet that criteria. It wouldn't have those properties. It would have a lesser degree of them, which means it's just not it doesn't meet that definition of a maximally great being.
Yes, but I'm trying to think of an example where you have a being that's not defined as a maximally great
Mm-hmm.
being necessarily, but you're trying to define a being in which
That's lesser than that.
Yeah, well,
to some degree.
If it didn't exist, it would be less.
Yes, we're right. I mean, and we're just talking about existence here. It's either a 1 or a 0. It either exists or it's either possible that it does exist, or it's impossible that it exists, and so it doesn't exist. But then anything that doesn't have these maximal properties would be a lesser being. Now, it's definitely possible that that being could exist in some possible world, but if it's not maximally great, it wouldn't exist in all possible worlds, and then therefore doesn't necessarily exist in the actual world. Does that make sense? So a maximally great being, according to like Plantinga's argument, is one that will exist in all possible worlds. And once you say that it exists in all possible worlds, that basically essentially is saying that its existence is necessary, and so it exists in the actual world. But lots of things could exist in some possible states of affairs that couldn't exist, that doesn't necessarily exist in the actual world.
But isn't the reason that he claims that if it exists in some possible world, it must exist in the actual world? Doesn't that hinge on the idea that otherwise the being would be less great? Right. Like you've defined this thing as greatest, and so whatever you put in that would make it less great defies that definition.
Yeah.
Well,
That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, though. It just means they aren't the ultimate.
Yeah, I
person.
guess as soon as you take away from this greatest, as soon as you take the greatest conceivable being and alter that or limit that in some way, it's no longer the greatest conceivable being. And so therefore, it doesn't necessarily exist in all possible worlds. And so therefore, it doesn't necessarily exist in the actual world. It could, but that's, the argument is trying to show that this greatest conceivable being, because of it being the greatest conceivable being, it simply must exist.
because that's part of the concept of being the greatest.
Right, yes.
So, but I guess I'm just wondering why you can't have some other claim of a concept that also requires existence. And it seems like...
Well, you could require existence. Something's existence, just for example, a really good pizza would have, or the greatest conceivable pizza would have to exist. That would to make it, to even begin to think of it as the greatest conceivable pizza. But then it's all the other things that are just subjective, where that starts to lose its coherence.
Yeah, but it seems to me like most good also seems to be pretty subjective. Like some of those responses to the island. And so on seem
Well, I do think that with omniscience, I think that one's a legitimate. It reaches a ceiling that you can get to a point where you can't know anymore. And so that would make it maximal, or omniscience, all knowing. And then it does seem to me, I thought about these three because I actually wondered what you're getting at here. And I wondered about all powerful. I was just thinking, well, can you get to a point where, you can't be any more powerful? And I guess you could. I can't really think of an argument against that. And then moral perfection, or all goodness, is like, can you get to the point where you can't be any more good? Like you have reached the tippy top, as Gary said, of being good. And that one too, I really couldn't come up with a way that's incoherent. But and I think that Plantinga and others have leaned on those three, because almost anything else, it seems like maybe there is some subjectivity to it, and you could either keep adding to it and not reach that ceiling. So I think that's why those three are, the properties that make up this argument.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a tough one, but like I said, I probably wouldn't bring up the ontological argument with, I might for fun for anybody, but I don't think it's a knockdown argument.
It's clever.
It is clever. And a lot of people, a lot of the people who have argued against it will just say that it's like you're just being clever, and then the only arguments against it I've seen are honestly from the literature that are trying to present it. as a, at least an argument worth thinking about. So I haven't heard all of the arguments against it, and I don't really, like I said, I don't know that I would. It's not going to be like the first bullet in my gun of apologetics or anything, but it is clever. I think that's